Let me now just say how absolutely delighted I am to introduce Professor Jim Clifford to talk to us here today. He is an absolutely superb person for us to have as part of our exchange program. He has very important personal experience of adopting and also a real academic expertise in this area. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all that he has to say. Sian, I think we're just about ready for you to start sharing the slides. I know that Jim will tell you when he wants you to move on. But without further ado, I'd like to formally welcome Dweud diolch am ymuno ni a croeso I Jim. Welcome to Jim. Thank you for joining us. Professor Jim Clifford, OBE, MSc, FCA, FRSA. We can't wait to hear what you have to say. I'll pass over to you now. Diolch.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thanks for the introduction to Wales. I wish I was in that glorious country at the moment rather than buried in central London, but never mind, never mind. I'm the CEO and founder of what is now Sonnet, started over 15 years ago, which, if you haven't come across us, is an impact-focused research, financial design, and strategic consultancy. By background, I'm an accountant, a corporate financier, and social researcher. And for my academic work, I publish with Sheffield Hallam, which partly owns Sonnet, and with City University of London. I was the author of what is lovingly known as the PACT report on the value of adoption and long-term fostering, published in 2011. And I also have first-hand experience, as Sally mentioned, first-hand experience of fostering and adoption of harder-to-place children. I have both, honestly, I've both benefited from the adoption system and have been critical of aspects of it. A home for me, this piece of work, isn't about creating a hierarchy of placements for children. It's not about saying foster care is best, SGO is best, adoption is best. It's about understanding how three forms of placement, three forms of permanence, achieve outcomes, positives, and how they match to the differing needs of different children, and the value we can attribute to those, for those that like Pound's value, both in social terms and in economics. All placements can serve the needs of children well, if the right placement is chosen for the right child. And that, in many ways, is the judgment of Solomon when you're trying to do it in practice. And this study came about from a concern that adoption was not being considered for children who may benefit from it. And indeed, some of its findings do suggest that that is actually the case. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So the focus of this report is to explore and articulate the benefit and value of adoption to the child, their family, and to wider society, set against other forms of long-term permanence for those children. Special guardianship and long-term fostering, with a bit of an overlap into residential care, long-term residential care for youngsters for whom it's appropriate. It's to explore the literature since 2010, when that PACT report was done. And that literature has been massive in the time and seems so disjointed and at times contradictory. So can we not knit it together and create a consistent narrative through it that helps us all? And then finally, to reflect on how the situational aspects of adoption, the context in which it plays out in real life terms, create or compromise value, including the social, legal, and societal setting in which that's played out. And on to the next slide. Methodology. We like a good solid methodology, but we also like to see what it was. And this is unashamedly it's robust, but it's a mixed methods study, bringing together and reconciling information from multiple sources spanning 10 plus years, including a very solid current gathering together of information. It's similar to the earlier PACT study and follows best practice in handling research within complex adaptive situations. And there's nothing so complex and so in need of adaptation as parenting children through these different forms of permanence. It tackles this by doing the literature review. The academics amongst us would see that actually as a rapid evidence review, in fairness. But it's spanning both grey and academic publication and statistical data and service user data, and has had access to some of the original core data of things like the benchmarking studies by Adoption UK. It's then worked with workshops and interviews, semi-structured interviews with over 30 industry experts, and you can read, I trust as well as I can on the screen, it's clinical psychologists, academics, social workers, the local authorities, members of the adoption and special guardianship leadership boards, and it does span, in as much as we can at the moment, the fostering experience, the SGO experience, and the adoption. It then builds story-based archetypes, storylines, and explores what would have happened to these typical children within the need for permanence. What would have happened to them if adopted, if placed under SGO or long-term fostered, but based with those choices and those junctions based on what is appropriate and reasonable in the light of their situation and their need. So it very much follows the story of the child, that a child like this could have been in an adoptive placement or an SGO, but is unlikely to have been long-term fostered, or could have been long-term fostered or in resi care, and so on. So it very much follows the storylines. It's a four-stage process we've followed and informed throughout by a steering group of professionals, commissioners, and academics, commenting, guiding, and refining our focus as we go. So the evidence review, the workshops and interviews, then developing the timelines and the theories of change, explanations as to what's happening and what's causing it, crucial. And then the evaluation is both describing what is coming about and how it's happening, and is modelling it in financial and economic terms. It's very much find the outcomes, value the outcomes, rather than creating economics in a vacuum. If you read through the report, and I hope you will, you'll find we also explore in a bit of detail approaches within that theory of change. It's not just what happens to the child, fact, they get placed, fact, this happens next to them. It's how it happens. It's the character with which parenting, professional support and other services are built around them that is crucial to the success. Thinking about those values, we don't put values on all possible outcomes. You never do, because some are less certain, some are further into the future, some are not naturally quantifiable. In some cases, a quantification in pounds value would mask the importance of the underlying human reality. All of our figure work is confidently, it's at least this. It could be a lot more than this in value, but it is at least this. And as you will find if you are enthused enough to wade through the appendices in the report, we give the detail behind the assumptions that have been made. You may have a difference of view with them, which is fine. That's there for you to be able to do this. Now, one or two of the critics on the way along when this was first published and commented on in the Children's Services Press said the comparables for SGO and fostering were not comparable with the adoption because adopted children were younger at point of placement than the SGO and fostering ones. Well, that point has been tackled in the detail of the figure work, as you will see from the appendices. So it really was on the basis of if this child is 4 when placed for adoption, we are looking at an equivalent child that is 4 when placed for fostering or SGO. So there is quite an intricate equivalence that we've endeavoured to build in through it. But you'll take your views as to whether that's appropriate or not. So let's move on to the next slide, please, Sean. So we built the storylines for the archetypical children based on 7 arenas of need or strength. Call them what you will. We've recognised that adverse childhood experiences do affect the ultimate outcomes, and certainly the challenge of parenting the children and them recovering. They're exhibiting challenging and dysregulated behaviour and how that is handled in a home and school setting. Recent life events, crises that have arisen. Their balance of relational well-being and the importance of key relationships within their lives. Clinical factors. Some of the clinical specialists on the panel were at pains to point this out, that for some children, I think they have fetal alcohol spectrum difficulties, they may compromise how far a child can progress. They may affect how they progress. They may affect how they respond. Identity, race, religion, equality. This isn't about a glorified tick box of whether children with brown skin are placed with families with brown skin. It's deeper. It's much more about support and how can that child's identity be not just preserved, but developed into something of which they're proud and comfortable with. And last but certainly not least, whether they come as part of a sibling group and how the dynamics are within that sibling group. So you'll see one of the archetypes we've looked at is a child within a sibling group. Okay, Sean, next please. This is getting more like grids and more like maths and economics by the minute, isn't it? So this is a sort of a reduced version of the summary of comparisons we're making within the report. So the comparison of storylines from those detailed archetype stories, we've derived 4, we've called them factual profiles. They are 4 adoption profiles for the child. And then we've said in each of these cases, the alternative routes to permanence that they might have enjoyed are a mixture of special guardianship, fostering, and residential care placement. Why we've taken this particular mix, and why we haven't followed through from the archetype stories is developed in some detail within the text of the report. But if we'd followed through the exact stories which have informed this, we wouldn't have been able to unpick the intricacy of the comparison to the counterfactual and derive the numbers from it. But nevertheless, they are very firmly based on these realistic storylines. So if you look there at line 1 as an example, 10% of the children in the coming forward for adoption would be arguably with low level of needs. These things are comparative. That doesn't mean no or little needs. That's low compared to the very high end. And that you can't quite see under the picture is that the alternatives there would be that they might be placed in special guardianship, they might be placed in foster care, and broadly on a 9-to-1 ratio. So you see out of that 10%, 1% as an alternative would be in special guardianship. So let's move on to the next slide, if we may. Now, adoption, we're moving into the section about the findings now. Adoption is for the few. It's not for the many. The numbers, notwithstanding we're at a low ebb in the number of placements at the moment, but even when it was at a high ebb, perhaps during the about a decade ago, it was still a minority of children coming into care for whom adoption is appropriate. It's for the few, not for the many, but it secures many benefits for those for whom it is the right solution, not least long-term support beyond 18 and a certainty of placement and belonging. Some of the children who've gone through adoption and some of the professionals would argue it's not absolutely certain, and it is. But there is at least a first instance of certainty that you will be within that family through to and beyond your majority. It brings significant value as against the two alternatives, special guardianship and long-term fostering, in two main ways that we've been thinking about. Better outcomes and long-term stability and support, and lower cost to the local authority. Take those less as value statements and more as categorization. The falling placement numbers, is this because there is some clear messaging coming through the professional and court system, which doesn't appear to be right? Well, the two forms of clear messaging we've seen coming through where we question whether they're actually helpful, indeed right, is one is there's an argument that adoption is the last resort as opposed to a valid resort for the right child. Debate there. There's a lot in a word, a lot in emotion in a word, the last resort. And secondly, that there is assumption, it comes through quite strongly in the court system and from a number of social workers we spoke to, that adoption severs all ties with the birth family. Not sure exactly how that comes around legally. Yes, the child changes their name and there's a change of parenting responsibility. But the evidence coming through from the adoption barometer with Adoption UK, and indeed from subsequent studies, the recent one by PAC UK, suggests that it is absolutely not true that it severs all ties with the birth family. So, question, are we working on inappropriate messaging? So, with that backdrop of apparently we may be working in an uneven playing field with some mismessaging going on, which may or may not be in the interests of the child. Let's just have a look at the effects of adoption and special guardianship and fostering, and broadly how they pan out. So any of those forms of permanence, the agency responsible is bringing value, supporting and upskilling those who are parenting the child, enabling the process of placement, informing and engaging with wider professionals, and delivering ongoing support, indeed bringing communities of support around the family. Works differently in the three types of permanence, but it's still broadly the same. The parents then provide for the child or children safety, security, meeting basic needs, but also therapeutic input in their parenting, healing, developmental parenting, and parenting the age of the inner child. The benefits are felt by the child, we hope, but they're also felt by the wider community and the wider area and economy. Okay, let's move on to the next, if we may. Oh, thank you. There are clear differences in what is delivered by each of the three forms of permanence. And this diagram compares 5 outstanding factors, outstanding in the sense that they appeared the biggest and strongest key factors that came through in the research. So you'll see in adoption, we've got therapeutic approach, which appears to be present in many, if not most, the stability to 18 and permanently for the future to the next generation and beyond, developing identity and providing birth family contact. Special guardianship brings remaining within the birth family community, permanence to age 18, possibly beyond there, and almost certainly preservation of identity, cultural identity, personal identity. Fostering brings supportive, committed parent figures, even if they're not always the same year in, year out, or within a year. Potential for return to the birth family, local authority social worker support, easier access to local authority input, and indeed housing in the longer term. Now, special guardianship was arguably, from the literature, developed to bridge the gap between the degrees of uncertainty and change in long-term fostering and the switch of family perceived as a permanent severance of ties, is that right, in adoption. They were arguably not intended to be used to remove children's option for adoption. Yet, you look at the statistics, adoption numbers have fallen at a time when SGO has risen and fostering has stayed pretty much at the same sort of levels. So, are they eroding adoption space? It's hard to be sure, but it's possible. Sean, next please. So we said we'd do something on values. I've unashamedly spent more time on the human side because this is about the lives of children. Children are not a value, but the value of some of these means of support is both social and economic. So the value of adoption as against matched alternatives, picking up and developing the work in the PACT report, is at least $1.25 million per child expressed in present value. If you multiply that through by the number of children placed in for adoption in 2021, you'd be at £4.2 billion per annum. The way I treat these figures is, apart from reasonably confidently, is they just emphasize for those who are interested in the economics, we're talking about something that is economically significant as well as hugely significant for the children, finding the right path through all this. The 1.3 million, 1.25 million here compares against 734,000 in the 2010 study, which looked at a slightly narrower range of areas of cost, and was 12 years ago, and the costs have shifted since then, but was also under a different sort of regime and a different practice setting. The outline of the costs, you'll see the majority that have been recognised are within local authority, which of course clearly, back to the point as to how we did the cost, it is costs saved or not, and also outcomes for the child. Well, adoption on the whole is not funded by a local authority. Special guardianship may well not be funded, or certainly not at the same rates as foster care. Foster care and residential care are at higher rates. So you've got that coming through, but there is a lot of detail and intricacy within those figures about social worker involvement and time, and the Adoption Support Fund, which of course is available in SGO, and so on. You've got criminal justice outcomes. The economy outcomes are about future employability. Education ones are the relative success or otherwise within the education system, and NHS are about longer term health and mental health outcomes. Sean, next please. And there were some recommendations. We've travelled a long way through this report in terms of the sheer range of things we've been looking at discovering. And it was important not just to present the story of what's driving the value, the differences for different children and the numbers, but also to draw out some big points that seem to scream from the margins at us. Things we need to get a grip on. Revisit and develop the understanding and practice of birth-family contact. Now, there is the point I mentioned about, does adoption cause severance? Does SGO create a, some have described it as a sort of blissful retention within a birth family, or has it got its own challenges? And foster care, where does that stand on family contact? But it's not just does it form that distinction, but right the way across the board, we need to develop the depth, the understanding about what we do know about birth family contact, how it can be delivered well. Recent PAC work, which postdates this report ever so slightly, tells a story of keeping going with letterbox contact and with some face-to-face contact, and then almost it falling off a cliff as the child gets further and further into placement, and a story of birth family not responding. How do we support birth families in tackling this very difficult situation, yet supporting their children? So the whole understanding of it and the development of that support needs to be tackled. SGOs, some placement with friends, quite a lot of placement with members of the family. If a placement has happened where the child is not able to stay with their parents and they've been placed with grandparents, just as an example which does occur, what does that create for family dynamics? So the grandparents have got to support the child and want to, and yet they may feel torn with their own feelings and relationships with the children, with their own children who are the child's parents. We need more support in that field. The level of training of SGOs is not the same as it is for adoptive parents by and large. Why not? There's a number of questions need to be tackled, and then we need to evaluate the long-term outcomes of children in SGOs. Hard to do at the moment because they've only been around a relatively short time. But that does need tackling and tackling properly. decision-making meetings for children. This was coming through from a number of different sources, both the local authority ones and the department ones and the agencies and the medics. Decision-making meetings for children are frequently being done without any knowledge of adoption in the room. We're not saying that adoption is right for all children at all, but without all the options properly argued and explored for the child, how can we come to the best decision? And the guardians, they are key to getting great outcomes for these children, not for delivering them, but in making sure the child's voice is heard and the child's needs are represented. What are we doing about supporting them through developing their knowledge in this very challenging and interesting and changing environment? Collaborative working between the voluntary and statutory services. If you were part of the debate around the development of the regional adoption agencies, there was a lot of wonderful things said about how the voluntary and statutory services were going to work well together. And at best, it's only been delivered in part. We were hearing a lot of conflicting views, one side against other, people not communicating, not understanding each other's perspectives. No real lack of willingness, but the link up isn't happening there. And we were getting the impression of decision making being made with a preference to in-house placements, I hate to say on cost grounds, rather than the best possible place for the child. A real challenge and debate there. And last but not least, permanence. Permanence in adoption, permanence in SGO, and permanence in fostering, actually, if you look at the detail, mean three different things. So permanence in adoption means being part legally of the same family with an entitlement to stay with that family through to and beyond 18. Some boundaries around that. In fostering, permanence means a decision to keep in long-term fostering until 18 or 16. If we just take those definitions, it would be easy to assume we're comparing like with like, but in practice, that may mean that the long-term fostering doesn't deliver confidence for the child in the consistency and sustainability of locations, parenting opportunities, hope for the future, and the rest of it, because of the shift around of placements that does, on the statistics, happen during fostering. So let's be realistic and let's try and get some consistency in the meaning of permanence between them. Okay, Charlotte, last one. So this report looks at literature across a wide range pertinent to the subject. It looks at the lives of the children and uses the insights of professionals and parents to understand directions of travel, the changing storylines of these children. It brings in and knits into a coherent narrative a range of other relevant studies. It gives a picture of a large space and draws out some really important points that, if we respond wrongly, risk our children. Please discuss it, debate it, challenge it, but don't ignore it or pick holes in minor aspects and miss the big point here. The numbers are indeed developed by comparing like with like, and I believe are both fair and conservative. How number isn't the point. It's a big value to the state from each adoption, and if there are children for whom adoption with contact in the child's best interests would work, which don't happen, we and the child lose out. So we do very much need some more evidence about outcomes in SGOs. We need more evidence about long-term outcomes from adoption. Sadly, the DFE funded piece of work only seems to go through to age 18 on its longitudinal study, and it, like any longitudinal study, won't be around for a while. We need more research in this area. So that's all I've got to say to introduce it. I trust that was helpful, but over to Sally and to questions. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was a very, very stimulating talk. As you can see, the chat is already getting quite lively. I mean, Wales being such a small place, I recognise lots of the names in the audience, and so I'd just like to let you know you've got a really wonderfully informed audience, which is great. I can spot amongst our attendees academics, senior sector leaders in children's services and adoption services here in Wales, and senior managers, lots of practitioners and adopters. So you've got a really informed audience who I think have been absolutely fascinated by everything you have to say. I think your analysis is very important, and it's such a contribution to our understanding that you've brought up to date this work, because they do date economic evaluations do date quite rapidly. I think you gave a balanced and very recognisable reflection of different routes to permanence that reads very well across the border into Wales as well as into England, because our patterns aren't all the same, as some have been commenting in the chat, but there are certainly, we've seen similar, although not identical, changes in adoption rates, for example, over recent years. You've given us some good challenge to some assumptions, particularly around the assumption perhaps held more amongst those who are less involved in the field, but that permanent ties to birth families are severed by adoption. That's not true either practically nor emotionally. And I think that's a very important point, and part of how we need to change our understanding of the meaning and value of adoption in contemporary times. And you rightly point to the changing nature of permanency routes and the need to further understand the value of special guardianship orders for children and their wider families. And something that has some different patterns in Wales has been pointed in the chat. Now, I've got lots of burning questions, and I was expecting to have to kick things off because sometimes people are a bit shy about coming forward with questions. However, that has not been the case today. So I'm going to be a good chair and not come in with my questions, and I'm going to go in order, and we'll get through as many as we can. So I'm going to urge you, Jim, not to be like me when I'm in these sessions. I'm trying to give quite brief answers to things. I'm notorious for giving very long answers. So I'm going to go to Karen Mosedale's question first and ask you, were adopted people and children, and perhaps adopters as well, part of the industry expert panels?
No, they weren't. The expert panels were drawn from exclusively from professionals, partly within budget available and partly within the time available. It was not possible to go in detail to them and involve them and get enough to get a balanced viewpoint from them. So we used the Adoption UK barometer information and the underlying details. Just thinking a little bit further, incidentally, some of the professionals on the panels were adopters, but they were not there as adopters. So I think I've got to say no, the parents and the adoptive children were not directly on the panels.
Okay, is that something that you would potentially do differently in a different study, or did you feel it wasn't the right thing for this study?
It was something I would much prefer to have that involvement, but to do it, as soon as you get an adopter onto a panel or an adopted person, you get an expert in a case study of one. for the most part. And so in order to get a balanced enough view, you've got to get quite a few of them, and you're into a wider exercise to be able to do it.
Okay.
So yes, much better if we can, but another exercise which needs doing as a follow-on to this, to expand that.
Thanks, Jim. Gareth, you've put a couple of comments in, but I'm in your first one now about how this is probably about comparing costs, I presume, how some local authorities now match funding received by foster parents. That of course wouldn't apply to SGOs for extended birth family. I'm not sure, Gareth, whether you mean for SGO placements or adoptive placements. Are you happy to come off mute, Gareth, and just clarify that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, really interesting. I think there's so much in there, and yeah, just one bit that jumped out at me, and I wasn't aware of this until recently, is that there are some local authorities who will say to foster parents, and basically have a general rule across the children's services, that if an SGO is granted for a foster parent, their general rule is that they will match the ongoing payments that the foster parent receives. And I think obviously that is helpful in terms of reducing the barriers to switching from fostering to an SGO from the perspective of the person who's doing it, but also is an interesting point in terms of how that impacts people who happen to be related to the children or child in question, because obviously they're potentially going down more of a kinship SGO sort of arrangement, and wouldn't be entitled to similar funding that could still be put to good use. You know, children are expensive and need funding regardless of your kind of DNA relation to that child.
Thanks, Gareth. And I'm wondering, Jim, if you could also tie that in with Chris's point about if you've noticed at Chris Holmquist that we have more SGOs with foster carers in Wales than in England, and thinking about how that might affect outcomes for children.
Yes. Well, with the original idea, if you go right back to its source about SGO, was about creating a permanence and a link in with their original community and family. Minimal change, maximum permanence. You've got the foster parents becoming SGO parents, and a similarity and a matching of funding,
yes,
so that essentially we're not blocking out great parenting, which is in the child's interest, by reason of wanting to make that permanent and give the parent more of a say in the child's upbringing, which has got to be a great idea. However, of course, if we shift that boundary and say that those are then funded, there's an equity arising for the foster parent and for the child moving into the SGO, but then an inequity that you get two types of SGO, funded SGO, or somewhat funded and fully funded SGO, which I think is very unfortunate. I think, given the importance is about permanence, which we're hearing from the report, the debate really is around whether you should have a split of the two types of SGO, funded and unfunded, rather than whether it is right for the funding to be maintained when it moves from foster caring through to SGO. If we recognise the specialism that is involved and the huge commitment that's involved in supporting these youngsters who haven't been born to us by whichever means of parenting we're delivering, then there is possibly an argument for funding more of it. But that costs, and there is then a boundary somewhere in the midst of kinship care, which creates a problem. So I think wherever we cut that boundary, there's a challenge of inequity, which works against the interests of children. We're not careful. Really challenging one. Good points, well made.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to move to Alia's question now, which is, she thanks you for your interesting work, and what's your hope for the impact of this report, especially regarding social workers and court professionals?
Well, I hope they'll listen. I have to say, Wales, you'll say, of course, has been more forward-thinking in its response so far than England, but I hope England may get it and catch up with your encouragement, if nothing else. I hope it means that we can create more of a level playing field between the different types of placement. We can make fostering more permanent for youngsters, real childhood permanence, as opposed to theoretical permanence that confuses the courts, arguably. That we can get clarity of decision-making in a level playing field with a clarity of language that removes all these suppositions that I fear work against the interests of children. I mean, let's be in no doubt about this. These are wonderful human beings that we're trying to support through any of these forms of permanence. And the parents that are called to do that are themselves both not special and very special, and need every support they can get not to be isolated in that very important job. We can do better. We can do much better than we're doing.
That's really, such an important point. And I think we're going to move on now to talk about that support by looking at Chris Holmquist's question, which is a bit of a challenge, I think. And I also wanted to ask you something that's a bit of a challenge in the other direction. So I'm wondering if you could bear with me presenting you Chris's question and then another sort of slightly counter question from me, but it's all going to be about in-depth support for adoptive parents. So Chris says, as you can probably see in the chat, you spoke about creating communities of support around adoptive families. There is concern by some working within adoption services that increasing availability of therapeutic support may lead to dependency on professional services. Did the study provide any evidence in relation to this? So that's a really interesting argument and not one I've heard before. So I'm sure you'll have a view on that, Jim, both perhaps potentially from a personal as well as an academic point of view. My question was a little different in that I was wondering whether there was a slight effect on your costings for adoption and related to the inadequate support levels that is sometimes provided to adoptive families by universal services in particular, such as accessing mental health services or additional support in education services, for example. And that might be particularly when supporting young people through teenage years and into adulthood, which we know is obviously, our support as adoptive parents doesn't stop at 18, as it doesn't for any parent. So are you reflecting what are the costs for adoption support rather than what they should be? So I think, and Chris is talking about, are we sometimes creating too much dependency on services? So slightly different angles, but they're both asking you about adoption support. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect sense. So Chris, dealing with your point, first of all, when we're talking about communities of support here, yes, that does involve elements of the professional support and professional therapeutic services, but more firmly, it involves human communities and the support within those around the families. And this came through also in work we did with community of adoption support agencies and many others, 2016, 2017, where you probably heard the comment, quickest way to lose your friendship group is to adopt or foster a child. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, but we did hear and still hear stories about how lonely the parents in any one of these three are, and dealing with the children and dealing with some challenging relationships and supporting them. So we didn't hear anything about a dependency on professional support. We did hear about reluctance to get professional support. We did hear about, in all of those settings, we did hear about families that find it so wearing to try and get professional support that they give up and try and go it alone, not always for the better. On the effectiveness point, Sally, the effects of inadequate support, we haven't costed those in. We don't have enough data to be able to do that. One of the points, I actually can't remember if it is in the report or exactly where it is, but it certainly did come up in this and other studies, is the amount of cost and energy that is going into gateway services, proving that someone is entitled or isn't entitled to the service. And we did hear quite a lot about the difficulty of obtaining support, of arguing support, and the challenges of working out if you're entitled to adoption support funding or not. I think it does beg this question around, are our public services being administered in the most effective way, cost-wise, if too much of the funding is going into proving whether someone's entitled or not, rather than delivering the service. That's a theme that came up, but we haven't explored it in the numbers.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that really thoughtful response to both mine and Chris's questions. We don't have time for any more questions or comments, but I just wanted to note for you to see, Jim, that we've got some really important comments from Karen Mosdale, Wendy Keedon and Sarah Thomas, and Ali has given a thank you at the end, but some real experts there in the field in here in Wales, giving you some important comments, and for everyone else to see as well. And you'll know that we're trying to do adoption differently here in Wales, have been doing for a few times. I've been delighted to see Suzanne Griffiths is logged on, who's the head of our National Adoption Service here in Wales. And you know, we're trying to do things differently, and some comparison at some point of the different ways that we're funding adoption support between Wales and England would be absolutely fascinating for future research. So maybe that should be your next commission. But I would just like to finish by thanking you again very much for this wonderful contribution to our Reframing Adoption series. Thank you so much for all that you've provided with us today and all the thinking. And everyone who attended, please come again to more of our Rethinking Adoption webinars. Please make sure you are signed up to ExChange to hear about all of our latest offers to you, and please share the news with your friends and colleagues about it as well. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am ymuno gyda ni heddiw.